La Prestige wasn't just a restaurant, it was a performance. Every flicker of candlelight, every polished edge of marble, every soft note of classical music was designed to remind guests that they weren't just eating, they were belonging. Wealth didn't just open the door here. It determined where you sat, how you were served, and whether your presence carried weight or was quietly brushed aside. At the center of it all sat Ethan Davenport, a man who had spent his entire life believing that wealth wasn't just power, it was proof. Proof that he mattered more. Proof that his comfort came first. Proof that those who served him existed for his convenience and nothing more. His voice carried across the dining room, loud and certain, as he talked about his latest investment. A luxury resort somewhere offshore where the right kind of people could vacation without unpleasant surprises. Laughter followed him like perfume, the kind of laughter that wasn't about humor, but about power shared between people who saw the world the same way. Ethan never truly looked at the people who moved around his table. They were hands, not faces, background figures meant to keep his world smooth and spotless. That's why he never noticed Michael Carter when he walked in. Michael moved differently, not out of insecurity, but with the calm confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. His suit was tailored, sharp, but never flashy. Wealth didn't need to announce itself when the person wearing it knew exactly who they were. Michael chose a table in the corner, away from the center stage Ethan had made for himself. It wasn't that Michael couldn't sit up front. He had earned that right a dozen times over. But tonight, Michael wasn't here to be seen. He was here to see. The restaurant's manager noticed him instantly. One glance and the calculation was made. Dark skin, no entourage, no loud announcement of who he was. The manager assumed Michael was just passing through, maybe lucky enough to book a table, but not important enough to deserve attention. So the service split like a fork in the road. Ethan's table became a stage for wine pairings, chef's recommendations, and constant hovering attention. Michael's water glass stayed empty for 20 minutes. No one rushed to greet him. No one asked if he needed anything. To the staff, it was effortless, this quiet exclusion polished to perfection. It was never hostile, never loud, just a gentle removal from the spotlight, a polite invisibility. Michael noticed. Of course, he noticed. You don't spend a lifetime moving through rooms like this without learning how bias wears a smile. He could have said something, could have cleared his throat, demanded attention, made sure they understood exactly who he was and how much he was worth. But Michael didn't, because Michael knew something Ethan never would. Sometimes silence is the loudest answer of all. Jamal Harris knew the moment he saw the table assignment. Table 7, Ethan Davenport's table. His stomach tightened, but he straightened his tie, smoothed his apron, and reminded himself, he needed this job. Rent didn't care about pride. He took a deep breath, stepped toward the table, and opened with a polite smile. Good evening, gentlemen. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Ethan didn't smile back. Instead, his eyes dragged up and down Jamal's uniform, pausing just long enough to make his point. New here? Ethan asked, voice smooth but edged with something sharper. Hope you can handle a table like ours. Jamal kept his tone even. Yes, sir. I'll do my best. He filled the water glasses, careful not to spill a drop. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching every movement like Jamal was a rookie auditioning for a role he wasn't qualified to play. So, Ethan said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, what's your plan, kid? Work your way up? Maybe one day you'll sit at a table like this. Laughter followed, soft and smug. It wasn't the joke that made them laugh. It was the shared understanding that Jamal didn't belong. Jamal swallowed hard, but his hand stayed steady. He'd heard worse, lived through worse. He nodded politely and stepped back, ready to fade into the background. But Ethan wasn't finished. Bet you dream about that, huh? Ethan smirked. Suits like ours, bottles like these. You just keep grinding. Who knows? Maybe you'll get lucky. The table laughed again, louder this time. Jamal forced a smile, the kind every service worker learns. The one that says nothing, agrees with everything, and lets dignity bleed quietly inside. Across the room, the manager stood near the bar, watching. He could hear every word. He could see what was happening. But he didn't step in, not once. He only offered a slight nod, silent permission for Ethan to continue. Jamal took a slow breath and moved to the next task, refilling Ethan's glass. Ethan made sure his elbow accidentally knocked into Jamal's arm, sending a few drops of water onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Careful there," Ethan said, mock concern dripping from his voice. "Wouldn't want to mess up the place." The laughter rolled again. Jamal's fingers curled into his palm, nails digging into his skin just enough to ground him. His voice didn't crack. "Apologies, sir." "Don't worry," Ethan said. "You'll get the hang of it, eventually." Trip after trip, refill after refill. The pattern repeated. A comment about Jamal's tie being crooked. A joke about whether he'd ever eaten at a place this expensive. Each insult served like a side dish, disguised as conversation. And each time Ethan glanced at the manager, all he got was that same approving nod. The message was clear. This is the way things worked here. Know your place. Take the hit. Smile through it. But no matter how many times Ethan tested him, Jamal never snapped. His hands trembled only when he turned away. His voice shook only in the silence between breaths. He wasn't invisible. He was enduring. And Ethan, for all his money and power, couldn't break that. Michael Carter sat alone in the corner of La Prestige, a quiet seat with a clear view of the entire room. It was the kind of table that was never offered to people like Ethan Davenport, the kind placed just far enough from the center to make someone easy to ignore. But Michael didn't mind. In fact, it was exactly what he wanted. From where he sat, Michael saw everything. The way Jamal stood straighter than any other waiter, his posture not just professional, but braced, like someone expecting a hit before it even came. Michael saw the way Ethan's eyes scanned Jamal's uniform, the subtle curl of his lip as if simply being served by a young black man was some kind of inconvenience. He caught the slight hesitation in Jamal's smile, the pause just long enough to swallow pride before saying, "Good evening, gentlemen." Michael didn't need to hear every word to know the story unfolding at that table. He knew the script by heart. He had lived it before. In boardrooms, on golf courses, even at restaurants like this, where wealth ordered not just food but the right to decide who mattered. But tonight, Michael didn't just watch Jamal. He studied Ethan too. The jokes Ethan made, the way they landed like a slap disguised as humor, were painfully familiar. Michael had heard them all before. "Bet you dream about sitting at a table like this, huh?" It was the kind of cruelty that didn't need to scream to hurt. It knew silence was its sharpest weapon, because who would stand up for Jamal? Not the manager who stood just close enough to see everything and just far enough to pretend he saw nothing. Michael had lived this. But tonight, he was no longer the man forced to swallow it. When Jamal finally reached Michael's table, there was no tension in Michael's gaze. No appraisal, no expectation of apology for being who he was. Michael looked him in the eye, not as a server, not as background noise, but as a man. "Thank you for your service tonight," Michael said softly. His voice carried the kind of weight that didn't need to be loud to be heard. Jamal nodded, polite as ever, but Michael saw the flicker of surprise. Respect was a language rarely spoken to him in places like this. As Jamal turned to leave, Michael reached into his wallet and slid a folded bill into Jamal's hand. Not just money, but something far more valuable, a silent acknowledgement. "I see you." Jamal's fingers curled around the bill, not out of greed, but out of gratitude. The manager, who had ignored Michael all evening, barely glanced in their direction. To him, Michael was just another quiet guest, not loud enough or white enough to matter. But as Michael stood, he didn't leave right away. He lingered at the door, turning back just long enough to meet Ethan's eyes. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't a threat. It was a look Ethan would recognize the moment he saw it. The quiet warning of a man who had spent a lifetime building power out of every door slammed in his face. And Ethan, for the first time all night, had nothing to say. Michael left without a word, but the weight of his silence stayed behind. Because some moments don't end when the door closes, some moments change everything. Morning broke over La Prestige like any other day, but the air inside the restaurant felt different. The staff arrived to find a mandatory meeting on the schedule. Something rare and never without reason. Whispers filled the kitchen. Did someone get fired? Maybe they're finally remodeling. Or maybe one voice murmured. The place got sold. Rumors buzzed like static, but no one knew for sure. Not yet. At exactly noon, Ethan Davenport strolled in, wearing his usual arrogance like a custom suit. He didn't notice the tension in the air, or maybe he mistook it for the usual fear his presence inspired. He dropped into his usual chair at table 7, barely glancing at the server who brought his water. Same table, same drink, and try not to screw it up, Ethan said without looking up. But today there was no usual rhythm, no smooth flow of service tailored around his whims. The staff's hands shook as they poured his wine. Their smiles faltered, caught between muscle memory and something that felt a lot like anticipation. Ethan frowned. What's wrong with everyone today? No one answered. Across the room, the private office door swung open, and there stood Michael Carter. Not the quiet man from the corner table, not the invisible guest they had overlooked. Today, Michael wore authority as easily as his tailored suit. Confidence without arrogance. Power without the need to prove it. The room went still. Forks paused mid-air. The sound of clinking glasses fell silent. Ethan's smirk flickered, but only for a moment. Well, if it isn't our mystery diner, he said. Did you come back to file a complaint? Michael didn't answer right away. He let the silence settle first. Let them feel the weight of it. Then with calm precision, Michael spoke. I'm Michael Carter. As of this morning, I'm the new owner of Le Prestige. The manager's face drained of color so fast it was almost comical. Ethan's smirk crumbled into something caught between confusion and disbelief. Michael's voice remained steady. This restaurant, from its menu to its staff policies, now operates under my leadership. And I want to make one thing perfectly clear. This will no longer be a place where wealth buys the right to disrespect. His words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Ethan leaned back in his chair, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. Relax, Carter. You're taking this way too seriously. It was just a little banter. Michael stepped forward, slow and deliberate. Banter, he repeated softly. That's what you call treating a hard-working man like a punchline? That's what you call turning service into a stage where you perform superiority? Ethan's smile faltered, but his ego pushed back. I spend good money here. I expect a little humor with my meal. Michael's expression didn't change. And now you'll learn that your money no longer buys permission to demean the people who work here. The manager tried to step forward, voice trembling. Mr. Carter, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Michael held up one hand. The manager stopped mid-sentence. No misunderstanding, Michael said. I watched every word, every glance, every time you stood back and allowed a customer to strip dignity from your staff. That ends today. The manager swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor. Michael turned to the staff, voice softening. This place will be built on respect, not fear, on service, not servitude. No more quiet cruelty hidden behind expensive menus. Then his eyes returned to Ethan. And as for you, Michael said, your table will always be here if you can manage to treat the people serving you like human beings. Ethan pushed back his chair, trying to save face. This is ridiculous. You're overreacting. Michael smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a man seeking approval. That's the difference between us, Mr. Davenport. You think dignity is optional. I know it's not. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized money couldn't save him from the one thing he had never expected. A man who didn't need his approval to own the room. As Michael turned to walk back toward the office, the staff, silent until now, began to clap. It wasn't loud, it wasn't staged, but it was real. Ethan stood there, shoulders stiff, while the applause rolled over him like a tide he couldn't stop. For years, Ethan had ruled La Prestige with nothing but his wallet and his arrogance. But today, both were powerless, because the man he tried to ignore now owned every inch of the floor beneath his feet. And Michael didn't have to raise his voice to show the world who truly belonged. For the first time in his life, Ethan Davenport didn't have the room under his thumb. The moment Michael Carter stepped forward, owning the space with quiet certainty, something inside Ethan shifted. Something cold, uncomfortable, and unfamiliar. It wasn't just the shock of seeing the man he mocked now standing in authority. It was the realization, the sinking, undeniable truth that every assumption Ethan had made Every quiet insult, every glance meant to shrink Michael down, had been aimed at the wrong man entirely. Ethan's smile, the one he always wore like armor, faltered. His voice came too quickly, too loud. "Well, this is unexpected." Michael didn't rush to answer. Instead, he stood calm, hands folded in front of him, his gaze never leaving Ethan. The silence stretched long enough for every server, every guest, and every trembling manager to feel it sink into their skin. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Unexpected for you, maybe. Not for me." Ethan forced a laugh, but even he could hear how thin it sounded. "Listen, whatever this is about, I'm sure we can clear it up. No need to make a scene." Michael's head tilted slightly. "A scene," he repeated like he was tasting the word. "You mean the kind you created last night? When you decided respect was only owed to people you see as equals?" The room shifted, silent witnesses leaning closer, hungry for every word. Ethan shrugged, still reaching for the casual confidence that had always saved him. "Come on now. It was just dinner talk. Jokes, you know? Harmless." Michael's eyes didn't move, but something behind them sharpened. "Harmless," he said quietly. "Harmless is what the powerful call cruelty when they're the ones delivering it." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but Michael wasn't speaking to him anymore. He turned to the staff, the waiters, the busboys, the cooks peeking through the kitchen door. "This restaurant," Michael said, his voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear, "will no longer serve dignity as optional. From this day forward, respect isn't a courtesy, it's a requirement. For everyone." Somewhere near the back of the room, a quiet exhale of relief passed through the staff. So soft it barely broke the air. "And if anyone," Michael continued, "believes their money gives them permission to insult, demean, or degrade the people who work here, they'll be asked to leave. Permanently." The words landed like a hammer against glass. Ethan sat straighter, his hands tightening around the edge of the table. "Hold on," he said, voice rising. "You can't seriously expect us to walk on eggshells just to eat here." Michael didn't look at him. "We expect you to act like a decent human being. If that feels like too much, this may not be the restaurant for you." Ethan's face reddened, but before he could find a reply, Michael turned toward the manager, the man who had stood silently the night before, offering Ethan his unspoken approval, nodding along to every cruel remark. Michael's voice softened, but the weight behind it grew heavier. "Your silence gave permission. You made this place safe for humiliation, as long as the money kept flowing." The manager swallowed hard, searching for a defense that didn't exist. Michael didn't wait. "You're done here, effective immediately." The manager's mouth opened, but no words came out. His power, the quiet control he held through silence and complicity, was gone, stripped away without ceremony. Ethan shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. You can't fire him for something I said." Michael's gaze slid back to Ethan. "I didn't fire him for what you said. I fired him for what he allowed." Ethan's bravado cracked. His voice lost its usual swagger. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just playing around." Michael gave him nothing. No anger, no argument, just silence. And in that silence, Ethan felt something he wasn't used to: accountability. It sat heavy on his chest, louder than any shouting match could have been. No witty comeback could erase the fact that for once, his money couldn't buy back the moment. For once, the rules didn't bend to make room for his excuses. Michael let the silence linger until it swallowed Ethan whole. Then, with the same quiet authority he had carried from the moment he stepped out of that office, Michael turned and walked away. For the first time, Ethan Davenport stood alone, not because the room had emptied, but because his power had. And in its place stood the truth, clear, undeniable, and no longer willing to be ignored. Jamal Harris had spent years blending into the background, but today he stood in the center. The announcement was brief yet powerful. Effective immediately, Jamal Harris has been promoted to head server. Michael's words carried no hint of charity, no tone of a favor being granted. This was not pity, it was recognition. A ripple moved through the restaurant. Some of the staff grinned, others whispered among themselves, but no one dared question it. The young man they had watched endure silent humiliations had been seen, not as a victim, but as a man who had earned his place through dignity and quiet strength. Jamal swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand tall. He wasn't used to being at the center of attention, but today, for the first time, it felt like he belonged there. Michael met his eyes. "You didn't just serve here, Jamal. You endured here. That's something no title can ever measure." Jamal's voice was steady, but filled with emotion. "Thank you, sir." Michael smiled. "No need to thank me. You earned this." Behind them, Le Prestige was changing. The restaurant, once a symbol of quiet discrimination, now stood as a model of accountability. New policies were introduced, firm, unshakable protections for employees. No more silent complicity, no more tolerated disrespect. A sign was placed near the entrance. "Respect is the cost of service." No exceptions. The news spread quickly, faster than even Michael had expected. Social media carried the story. The whispers turned into conversations. "Did you hear about La Prestige? That big-shot investor? He owns it now." Fired the manager on the spot. "Ethan Davenport? That rich guy who thinks money makes him untouchable? He got humbled. Big time." The city took notice. High-end establishments, built on the same quiet, unspoken rules, began to rethink their ways. For the first time, privilege was forced to reflect on itself. And at the heart of it all, Ethan Davenport sat at his usual table, but nothing about his world felt usual anymore. The weight of the restaurant was different now. The air didn't bend to him the way it used to. The servers no longer met his gaze with forced smiles or rushed attentiveness. They still served him, but they didn't fear him. There was a cold professionalism in their movements, a respect that was no longer given freely, but rather measured, controlled. For Ethan, this was a foreign experience. He was used to commanding a room without effort. Now he simply existed in it. Michael had given him no speech, no lecture. He hadn't gloated, hadn't thrown the past in his face. Instead, he had done something far worse. He had let Ethan sit in it, sit in the realization that money had never been his true power. Fear had, and now that fear was gone. Jamal approached Ethan's table with the same steady hands and calm demeanor he always had. But this time, he wasn't the one who felt small. Ethan barely looked up. "Water," he muttered, eyes trained on the tablecloth. Jamal poured it, setting the glass down with quiet precision. But before he turned away, he said something that made Ethan freeze. "Enjoy your meal, Mr. Davenport." It was a simple sentence, but it held no trace of submission, no careful politeness, no need for approval, just words. And suddenly, Ethan understood the lesson that no amount of wealth could erase. Respect wasn't something you bought, it was something you earned. Michael, watching from across the room, said nothing. He didn't need to, because in the end, Ethan's greatest punishment wasn't humiliation. It was watching the man he had dismissed take the one thing Ethan had always believed belonged to him: power. The night wound down, guests leaving, the hum of conversation fading. Before the evening ended, Michael crossed the room and extended his hand toward Jamal. Not as an employer to an employee, but as a man to another man. Jamal hesitated for only a moment, then clasped Michael's hand, firm and steady. Michael nodded. "This place is yours now, too." Jamal's lips parted slightly, eyes searching for the right words. But in the end, he simply nodded back. No words were needed. The moment spoke for itself, and with that handshake, the final thread of the old world unraveled. Wealth had not won. Arrogance had not prevailed. Dignity had. And in a world that had tried to bury men like Jamal, like Michael, that victory was worth more than all the money Ethan Davenport had ever spent.